Divine Divinity is an open-world action role-playing game made by Larian Studios in 2002. I think if BioWare had made a Diablo clone, it would look a lot like this. Personally, as far as ARPGs go, my gold standard for enjoyment is either the first or second Torchlight. I'm not entirely sure which one though, but I just asked myself, am I enjoying this as much as playing Torchlight? Unfortunately, I feel like Divine Divinity just barely misses the mark on that, and it's mostly just the game's age showing. I'm playing the Steam version of the game, and it runs okay out of the box. You just need to swap from DirectX to software rendering in the configuration program. The full screen resolution does go up to 1920 by 1080, but there's no windowed mode by default. If you do decide to play this, you're going to want to get DG Voodoo. Not only does it allow for a windowed mode, you also get all the missing DirectX features. There's also a patch to increase the text size of the game's font that isn't too hard to set up as well. I'm going to put a link to a Steam guide that helped me with fixing most of the problems I ran into, as well as a larger font patch in the description. Even after all the fixes, the game will still occasionally freeze or crash. I think it only happened 4 or 5 times while recording for this video, which isn't great, but it's not the worst from my experience. The only problem I couldn't fix was an audio issue. Randomly, the game will play a loud static noise instead of the intended effect. The guide that I used for fixes also had some steps to try and fix the audio issue, but it didn't work for me. It probably has something to do with how my audio is set up, so it could work for you, but if you use headphones, just be careful. You have a choice between 3 classes, with the guys on the left and the gals on the right. The main difference in the choice between the sexes here is what skills you start with, character portraits, and how your character is voiced. The differences in the classes is what you get out of the different stats and their special ability. Warriors spin around to smack things, survivors get to sneak around, and mages can swap places with other people. The stats work pretty much how you would expect them to based on your class. Strength lets you carry more stuff and makes you hit harder, intelligence gets you more mana, and constitution increases your health and stamina. Dexterity is the most important stat because it affects your offense and defense. Offense is how likely you are to smack an enemy with a weapon, and defense is how often you don't get smacked. Warriors get the most offense from dexterity, while survivors get the most defense, and mages get the short end of the stick. The first thing you should do after picking a character is save the game. There isn't any auto-saving, so you need to remember to save often. Dying in a dungeon and finding out my last save was an hour ago just destroyed my will to play at times. I know this is mostly my fault, but I guess I just grew accustomed to having the choice of where to spawn after biting the dust in other ARPGs. Fighting enemies is fairly simple. You left-click to attack, right-click for spells and abilities. Pressing Control targets the nearest enemy, and pressing space pauses the game, which helps with swapping abilities or drinking potions. The only thing that I think is wrong with the combat is that there's no real impact to the hits. It just feels like everyone's hitting each other with pool noodles and water balloons. I found that the early game heavily favors ranged builds, especially the mage. As an example, here's my level 6 warrior fighting an early game mini-boss. Oh yeah, the neat thing about dying is that the game doesn't have a game over screen, so you get to watch enemies wander around your corpse until you reload a save or start a new game. Now watch me take on the same enemy as a level 1 mage. The reason for this is that the spell you start with, Meteorite, is cheap, staggers enemies, and as with most spells, you can spam it as fast as you can click. On top of that, the spell scales with your character level, and the starting dungeon is full of skeletons and other undead. This gives the mage a way easier time dealing with the first area you're in. Now, this doesn't mean that smacking enemies or shooting them is bad overall. It's just that magic is the path of least resistance here. For physical attacks, there are 6 different melee weapons and 2 ranged weapons to choose from. The majority of static rare weapons are swords. If you want to use something else, you might need to camp out at a store or two to find a good weapon to use. I just wish there was an easy way to tell when a weapon is one-handed or two-handed at a glance. I haven't tried a build that focused on ranged weapons for a couple of reasons. The bows have a very large damage range, there's no sound effect for missing, and the talents for ranged weapons just seem worse to me than all the other options. There are also crossbows in the game, but I don't recall seeing any I felt worth using. Most enemies you encounter run right for you, and the only way to keep them at bay is spells that slow them down or summons, and at that point I feel like I should just be slinging spells anyway. There is a stamina bar, and I think stamina regenerates at a steady enough pace as long as you aren't running around. There are also stamina potions if you find yourself in a pinch and need more. You mainly lose stamina from running, and it's only noticeable early game or when running long distances. There are two skills that use stamina, and those are the Warrior's Spin Attack and the Survivor's Sneak. Everything else uses mana. The overworld is fairly large, and you are free to explore most of it from the beginning of the game. The areas that you can explore are the typical farms, graveyards, sewers, and forests. There are areas that are blocked off to you. Most of the hard-locked areas are related to quests in some way, but most of them just have strong enemies to try and stop you from wandering into someplace. The enemies themselves are all of the typical fantasy fare. You have oversized wildlife, thieves, undead, trolls, and orcs. Lots and lots of orcs. The thing is that not all of the enemies are too visually distinct from each other. For example, it feels like there's only one model for each of the different orc enemy types. When you have to fight this many of one specific enemy, I feel like you need some more variety in the way they look. Especially if you're going to place a higher level area right next to a lower one like an orc war camp. There are two methods of fast travel around the map to places you've been before. The first is the teleporters that you can find in various places. These are tied to the races inhabiting the land, and you need a specific scroll from them to activate and use the teleporters. How you get these scrolls is from exploring, doing quests, or they just hand them to you. The teleporters are usually placed near points of interest like towns or villages, but there are a few that are just placed in the middle of nowhere. The other teleportation method is from a pair of pyramids you get. You get the first one fairly early in the game, and can get the other one not too long after. Just don't try to get it immediately. Just get a few levels and some gear first. The game does try and warn you about the dangers of getting the second pyramid, but I felt it was presented as more of a joke than an actual warning. Once you have both, you can plop either of the pyramids down wherever you want and teleport between the two. This is very helpful in making your own base to drop off loot during dungeon dives, or to get out of a hairy situation. You can also pick up and move around certain objects in the game world. Sometimes you need to do this to find hidden items or passages. The items you pick up can't be rotated, only moved around, but you can place them wherever and make your own house or base with them. There are 3 pages of talents with 4 skill trees, and you can pick from any of the talents in them as long as you meet the level requirement. Except for one tree, but that one's locked until the end of the game. You get 1 skill point each time you level up, except on multiples of 5, which gets you 2 points. Extra points in a skill can be gotten from rewards for completing quests, on equipment, or in the case of magic, buying or finding spellbooks. What spellbooks you can find or buy is usually random, but if you're lucky or patient enough, you can just buy a talent point with gold. Each skill caps out at 5 points, and there doesn't seem to be any way to go past that with gear. Some of the talents are poorly worded or are confusing in how they work. For example, there's the Enchant Weapon talent. From the name of the talent and the tooltip, you would think that it only works on weapons, but it does work on armor as well. There's also a spell called Burning Wall. It does lightning damage. There are other things wrong with the descriptions, like you weren't told how long a time unit is anywhere, or that the passive abilities need to be cast. There are a bunch of different talents to choose from. Normally, I'd be happy about all the different choices I could make for different builds, but a lot of the ones here are either boring, redundant, useless, or mandatory. For example, there are 4 different talents that give extra vision in some way. Elven Sight is available at level 1 and gives 2 sight per talent point. Ranger Sight, which gives you a point in sight for each talent point, and you can start putting points in it at level 6. Wizard Sight is a spell that reveals a specific area around you and is at best situationally useful. The final talent is True Sight, and it allows you to see invisible enemies. To my knowledge, there's only one enemy type that turns invisible in the entire game. As for the mandatory talents, I personally believe there are 4 to 6 talents you need to take, and most of them need the full 5 points invested in them. Each character needs some points in Elven Sight and Enchant Weapon, and at least 1 point in Alchemy and Repair. The skills that I think are somewhat debatable is Identify and Know Creature. No creature lets you see enemy information like their level and resistances. I don't like having to spend 5 points on a skill for something that should just be baseline. The information you get from the talent is separated into the 5 points. You can see the information on enemies below certain levels, which is 10 levels per skill point. There are occasions where a group of low-level enemies are placed around a higher level one. This just feels bad to me to get a bunch of information about some enemies in a fight and then just get nothing. Then, once you have the skill maxed out, the text from the information goes from the health bar at the top of the screen to near the middle of the screen. Identify is just for identifying magical items, which you can get them identified at shops for a price, but there's some weirdness in when the stats for the item are rolled. As far as I can tell, things like item stats and shop inventories are rolled when you first mouse over them, which for certain things can turn this into a save-scumming hell depending on how unlucky you are. Honestly, I'd rather deal with identify scrolls than this, but in the end, this is just a skill that theoretically saves you some time and gold. Repair and alchemy are probably the best 2 talent points you can spend in the game. A single point in repair allows you to fix 60% of an item's durability. You can pay to repair items, but most of the time that means teleporting out of combat to run to a store. More points into repair increases how much is fixed, but that's only good for increasing the sale price of the item. A single point in alchemy allows you to mix health and mana potions of the same size together to make a restoration potion. More points in alchemy let you make your own potions, but shops usually have more than enough, and they also drop fairly often as well. The reason you want restoration potions is because they restore health and mana at a percentage of your maximum, instead of the flat amount you get from regular healing and mana potions. Enchant Weapon is one of those skills that starts off very underwhelming, but by the time you get all the points in it and hit the endgame, it's extremely powerful. The charms you get at the beginning of the game to slap into equipment aren't that good, but the ones you get at the end of the game give massive boosts to your character. A thing to note about the charms is that the ones that give health and mana are better than the ones that give constitution or intelligence. There isn't any way to respec your character in-game, so you need to be careful about what skills you actually invest in. This is a bit tricky because there isn't any way to tell when or if a skill is worth investing in at all. If I'm going to put points into something, I'd like to be able to tell the difference between making that choice and not making it. Like, as far as most of the warrior skills go, they're just a bunch of passives that don't feel like they really do anything. I feel like you could remove half the talents that are available and you wouldn't know they were gone. Still, even with everything I don't care for, there's still some fun to be had with some of the skills. My personal favorite combo is Resurrect and Aura of Command. This combo lets you make any enemy you kill turn into a summon. Do you hate the enemies that spam summoning spells? Well, you can raise it, and its spirit will start summoning for you. This one combo can get silly fairly quickly with the right choices. You will get spammed with the Out of Mana Bark if the enemy uses spells and you don't have a large mana pool. I feel like that's a small price to pay to be able to make your own near-infinite army and a Diablo clone.
No more magic. I don't have enough magical energy to do that. I can't perform anymore.
Personally, the way Larian Studios tells a story has always felt like they were an off-brand BioWare to me. I feel weird saying that now because they are the ones making Baldur's Gate 3. If you were to ask me why I feel that way, I really couldn't tell you. My best guess at it is because both Larian Studios and BioWare, in the first Baldur's Gate at least, were attempting to channel the same energy as The Princess Bride. Like, they're going to be earnest in telling a fantasy story, but they will point out when it's being silly at times. Overall, there isn't much to say about the story. You are chosen by some mystical force to find a representative from each of the races, plus a wizard, to perform a magical ritual so that you have enough power to stop the bad guy. Well, there were 2 others chosen to help, but, well, it's kinda obvious what happens to them.
A fool maybe, but I'm no coward. Come on, let's see the color of your blood, you swine!
No!
The main quest line isn't too awful, it's just a bunch of stuff you've probably seen before. Like, you need to stop a war between the elves and dwarves, or there's a plague infecting people living in the slums, and of course, since you're the chosen hero, you have to solve all of this. Outside of the main quest, there isn't much really going on. Quests are usually the standard go here, kill that, bring back something. There is a Thieves Guild, a Fighters Guild, and a Merchants Guild to join, but there really isn't much to them. The most you get out of them is a free talent point or two, and you really don't have to do much to get them. Conversations with NPCs usually have multiple dialogue choices, which for an ARPG is interesting. These consist of the usual asking about rumors, getting quests, and bartering. You can trade with almost every friendly NPC in the game. The shop UI is basically the same as the first two Fallouts. What the NPC sells is random if they aren't a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper's inventories are still random, but it's more in line with what kind of shop they run. There are a few things that make bartering annoying. You can't use the mouse wheel to scroll through the shop's inventory. The only way to tell what your currently equipped items are is just a faint yellow tint to their sell price. There is no easy way of comparing your items with the ones in the store, and you need to do some basic math. The only thing I found weird about the story is that one of the areas you can walk into is a camp full of soldiers. When you first visit the area, 3 wizards appear and mind control all the soldiers into attacking you, and you can kill every last soldier there. Normally, you would expect that killing this many soldiers in one place would get acknowledged, because of the invading orcs, but it doesn't really get brought up. One of the people responsible for doing this shows up later as someone you need to recruit, and all they have to say for it is that the people he was working for were jerks, and now they want to help you. The music isn't bad, but outside of the song in the main menu and some of the overworld music, I can't remember noticing there was music at all. It's just a bunch of generic fantasy adventure stuff you could slap into any RPG, and it wouldn't be too out of place. The voice acting is pretty good, if a bit generic. There were a few voices I did find annoying, but I could tell they were on purpose. Like, of course, the elven healer sounds like an overprotective worrywart.
Mardanius, my poor old friend. What are you doing outside?
The only thing that stood out were a few parts where everyone else is voiced in a cutscene and your character isn't. I think the game looks pretty good, and that's without the little extra stuff you get for going through the trouble of getting DG Voodoo working. Besides the lack of enemy variety, the only complaint I have is that there are some doors hidden by the camera angle. The doors can be seen by pressing the Alt key, which also shows items you can pick up like weapons and potions. For a game set in a fantasy setting, the environments were fairly mundane overall. The only things I can think of that stood out were a magic door and the River of Gold in the Dwarven Mountain Home. Each of the menus for your stats, inventory, equipment, minimap, and talents can be moved around on the screen. The inventory and equipment menus can be closed by right-clicking on them, and I kept doing this trying to use the repair skill, which got annoying at times. The stats menu shows all the relevant information about your character's offensive and defensive capabilities. The window itself is just barely big enough to contain everything in it. It doesn't show your character's base stats before enchanted items or buffs. If you want to know what your base stats are, you need to strip to check them out. Hovering over each of the stats shows a tooltip with a description of how it works. Like hovering over offense or defense shows the percent chance that you will be hit or be missed by enemies. Your diary contains all your active quests, a full-size map with objective markers, past conversations with NPCs, a list of every living creature you removed from this existence, and some commentary on your character's stats. The comments on your character stats are neat because at the start of the game it basically makes fun of you for being weaker than an old lady, and that a strong breeze could kill you. Then by the end of the game it actually respects you a bit. The menu to select what skill to use can get a bit cluttered by the end of the game, especially if you read every spell book you come across. It isn't terrible, I just think there has to be a better way to display all the different passives and abilities. I don't think the containers have a weight or item limit, at least I haven't hit one yet. So you can just slam as much stuff as you want into them. There isn't a button to press to quickly store items. You need to drag and drop them from your inventory into the containers. It almost seems like the game encourages hoarding, so if you know that's going to be a problem, you need to come up with some way to manage it before it gets too bad. Outside of the audio issues, there were some bugs I encountered. There are some that help you out, like the male warrior gets a free talent point for each of his starting skills just for saving and reloading. There's also an easy way to duplicate stackable items when splitting the stacks. At least one of the spellbooks has the wrong name of the spell on them. You need to double check the cover of the book with the images and the mage skills to see which spell it really is. I also found some chests that disappeared on me when I brought them outside of their dungeon. You can also get into some places that you weren't supposed to by tossing around your teleporter pyramids. I've also seen some stuff online about it being easy to break quests by rejecting them or by talking to people in the wrong order. I didn't run into any that stopped me from completing the game, but it is hard to notice a quest breaking unless you hit a dead end and know there's more to the quest line. Divine Divinity is one of those games where I wonder if I would have liked it more had I played it closer to its release. Playing the game today, it's just okay. There isn't anything really wrong with it. I feel like this is a good example of a game that just falls short of being great. The game has aged reasonably well, and while the combat is fairly basic, I did enjoy my time playing it. Divine Divinity is sold on Steam and GOG for $6, and that's an okay deal at that price. It often goes on sale for around 60 cents, and that's a much easier recommendation because you really don't have much to lose at that price. Thanks for watching the video.